So we're diving into The Arab Awakening by George Antonius, first published back in 1938. This book really is a cornerstone for understanding, well, a lot of what's going on in the Middle East today.
It is. It truly is. Antonius was a leading scholar, a true expert on the Middle East. And this book, it really provides this incredible analysis of, well, how the modern Arab world, how it came to be.
And what's striking, I mean, thinking about when it was written, is that it's considered the first, like, the very first real study of the Arab national movement, right? It kind of set the stage for, well, everything that came after.
Absolutely. I mean, right out of the gate, it was recognized as groundbreaking. The Daily Telegraph called it, and I'm quoting here, a brilliantly written book with objective and critical scholarship. The Observer, they chimed in too, calling it, and again I'm quoting, a good book written by a scholar, an expert, a very excellent and extremely able book.
Wow. High praise.
Yeah, right from the start. And it's because it was able to connect all these seemingly disparate events and weave them into this narrative of this emerging Arab identity, something that, well, no one had really done before.
And Antonius didn't just, sit in some ivory tower and theorize about all this. He dug deep, years in libraries across Europe and America.
Oh, yeah, yeah. But more importantly, he went to the source, right? He went to the Arab world itself. He traveled extensively. He spoke to people.
Yeah.
He conducted interviews, gathered firsthand accounts. I mean, he even acknowledged in the book how challenging that was. But he emphasized how vital those personal stories, how absolutely crucial they were to understanding the movement, to understanding the people.
Really brings it to life. So, okay, let's get into the heart of Antonius's analysis. He starts by laying out the foundations of Arab identity, right? He really sees that as the key to understanding how the national movement developed later on.
Exactly. He really emphasizes the unifying force, the power of the Arabic language, particularly after those early Islamic conquests. By the end of the 7th century, Arabic, it had become the official language in places like Syria, Iraq, absolutely vital regions.
And he makes this crucial distinction, and it's one that a lot of people, they get it wrong. They mix up the Muslim world and the Arab world, right? Not the same thing.
Oh, a really important point. Antonius, he makes it clear. The Muslim world, it's much, much bigger than the Arab world. The Arab world is part of it, but it's just a part. I mean, Islam spread far, far beyond those initial Arab lands.
Right.
From India all the way to North Africa.
So the Arab world, as Antonius defines it, it's shaped by this process of what he calls Arabization. So what does that mean? Like, what were the big results of this process?
Well, he outlines 3 lasting outcomes. First, you have the establishment of Arabic as the national language. And then you have the adoption, right? The widespread adoption of Arab customs, Arab ways of thinking.
Okay.
And finally, you have this influx, right? This infusion of Arab populations into those regions.
So you have this foundation of Arab identity that Antonius lays out. And then he starts looking at some of the historical moments, kind of early attempts at, well, almost an Arab empire. And he focuses quite a bit on Muhammad Ali in the early 1800s.
Right. Muhammad Ali, fascinating character. And Antonius argues that Muhammad Ali represents this early attempt, ultimately unsuccessful, but an attempt to carve out an Arab empire, right, from the territories of the Ottoman Sultan.
But it wasn't for lack of trying, was it? I mean, he had some pretty impressive successes.
No, not at all. He was a very capable leader. He completely reformed the military. He built up this disciplined, regular army, a strong navy. He conquered Sudan in 1820. He's pretty much wiped out piracy in the Red Sea. He even got involved in the Greek insurrection.
Wow.
Though he did suffer that big naval defeat at Davarino in 1827. But you're right. He had ambition. He had success.
And when he expands into Syria, he actually gets support from different groups, right? And Antonius talks about this. Why was he welcomed at first?
Well, you have to remember the context, right? The Muslims, many of them, they were inspired by the Wahhabis who had challenged the Ottoman Sultan.
Okay.
So they saw Muhammad Ali as a potential liberator from Turkish rule.
Makes sense.
And then the Christians, they knew that Christians in Egypt were treated better than under the Ottomans, so they had their own reasons for supporting him. And then you have people like Amir Bashir of Lebanon, a very influential figure. He actively promoted this idea of an Arab empire under Muhammad Ali's rule.
And Antonius even talks about when Ibrahim, Muhammad Ali's son, when he arrives in Damascus, he's actually greeted pretty warmly, isn't he?
Yeah, he is. And he's smart about it. He really plays up this idea of a better future under Egyptian rule. He talks about all the progress they've made, how things are different than under the stagnant Ottoman rule.
So it seems promising, but then it all falls apart. Why why does Mahim Ali's rule in Syria collapse?
Well, there's the European pressure, right? The European powers, they were worried. They didn't want him getting too strong. They wanted to keep the Ottoman Empire intact. So they forced him to accept that he could only rule Syria during his lifetime.
Oh, so no hereditary rule. That must have been a blow.
Oh, yeah, a huge blow to his ambitions. And then, he makes some mistakes. He imposes new taxes in Syria. He introduces conscription. And this causes a lot of resentment, a lot of anger, and eventually, revolts break out.
So it's interesting, he has all this success, he has ambition, he even has some support, but Antonius points to a deeper reason for his ultimate failure, for why he couldn't establish a lasting Arab empire.
You're right. And it's actually pretty simple. The idea of a unified Arab nation, it wasn't strong enough yet. There was no real widespread national consciousness. There was a desire to escape Ottoman rule, sure. But a true Arab identity, a sense of belonging to one nation, that wasn't there yet. And that's ultimately what undermines him.
This brings us to what Antonius really sees as the true beginning, the genesis of the Arab national movement, the period from 1847 to 1868. What were the key events that sparked this movement?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because it starts in part because of an unintended consequence of Ibrahim's rule. See, he was relatively tolerant, and this allowed for Western missionaries, both Catholic and Protestant, to come in and operate it.
Okay.
And these missionaries, they weren't necessarily hugely successful in terms of converting people, but they did establish schools and they brought printing presses, first to Cairo, the Bulak Press, and then to Beirut.
So they had this unintended impact on Arab culture.
Exactly. They helped spread knowledge. They helped spread Arabic culture. Figures like Eli Smith, he was instrumental in developing Arabic textbooks.
Oh, wow.
And Cornelius van Dyck, he really promoted scientific inquiry. So these missionaries, they were kind of these unexpected catalysts in this Arab intellectual revival.
Antonius makes this interesting observation about books in Syria at this time, doesn't he?
Yeah. He notes that there wasn't actually a huge demand for books, which he puts down to a general lack of education, a lack of literacy. And he also points out that, literary scholarship, it was generally more advanced among the Muslim Arabs because of the influence of the Quran, because of the emphasis on Islamic sciences.
So then you have this upheaval in 1860 in Syria, and Antonius considers this a real turning point. Why was this event so important?
Well, it was this moment of sectarian violence. And it was a real shock. It forced people to confront this moral stagnation, the dangers of sectarian hatred that was fueled by ignorance.
Right.
And it really spurred this renewed effort to establish schools, to challenge this intellectual obscurantism, to fight back against ignorance.
And from this period of turmoil, a new generation of Arab intellectuals emerges.
Yeah. Antonius talks about the students of Yazdegi and Bustani who were really inspired by this rediscovery of this rich Arab cultural heritage. They saw all these achievements, this intellectual and artistic brilliance, and this spirit of freedom that they felt was embedded in this heritage. And they started to advocate for liberation from Turkish rule. This marks the beginning of the Arab national movement, but one that's grounded in national ideal, not sectarian ones.
But Antonius notes that this early movement, it remained pretty weak for the next 40 years or so.
Yeah, it was still in its infancy, right? But there were key individuals like Boutros el-Bustani, who founded this influential review, Nafir Syria,
that's the trumpet of Syria, right?
Yeah, exactly. And its motto was powerful. Patriotism is an article of faith. This was revolutionary, really. I mean, Nafir Syria was the first publication of its kind to focus on national welfare. It drew contributions from writers across the Arab world.
Okay.
And it really fostered this sense of shared Arab identity, this idea of tolerance.
So let's move on to the reign of Abdulhamid II. That's from 1876 to 1909. How did his rule impact the Arab national movement?
Well, the Russo-Turkish War that happened from 1877 to 1878, that had a big impact, even though it mainly affected the European parts of the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
The war really intensified this discontent among Arabs because they were being conscripted, forced to fight in this distant war that had nothing to do with them.
And Abdulhamid himself, he was a pretty tough ruler.
Oh, yeah. Antonius describes his rule as a period of tyranny, a period of corruption, a real step back from the brief period of constitutionalism that had come before.
So how were the Sultan's Arab territories actually administered at this time?
So most of them were divided into these vilayets, which were essentially Ottoman provinces.
Right.
Like Beirut, Jerusalem, Mosul, Baghdad, Basra. But the Arabian Peninsula was a bit different.
Okay.
Out in the interior, places like Najd, Shemar, Turkish control it was pretty weak. It was hard to govern those areas. They were far away, communication was difficult. And the Arab tribes there, they were fiercely independent. They weren't going to just bow down to Ottoman rule.
It was a different story on the coast, though, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Along the coast, the Ottomans were facing a different kind of challenge. There, they had to contend with Great Britain. The British had their eyes on the region. You know, it was strategically vital for their empire, especially for their control of India. They already had Aden, they had Perim.
Though Abdulhamid, he had his work cut out for him domestically. What was his main policy towards his Arab subjects?
Well, he really doubled down on strengthening the Sultanate. He emphasized this link between the Sultanate and the Caliphate, the religious leadership of the Muslim world.
Right.
And he pushed this ideology of pan-Islamism, this idea of uniting Muslims across the world.
Okay.
He was trying to, tap into this religious fervor, this sense of unity, which he could then potentially use, if there was a war or a crisis.
And how did this focus on the caliphate, how did it play out in his foreign policy?
Well, he tried to use it to boost Turkey's standing on the world stage. He wanted to be seen as this pious caliph, this leader of all Muslims. He wanted the allegiance not just of his own Muslim subjects, but of Muslims living under British rule, French rule, Russian rule. He wanted to be a real player, a power broker, using his religious authority.
So he's cracking down on dissent, he's promoting this pan-Islamic unity. But Arab nationalist sentiment, it doesn't just disappear, does it? Antonius talks about these secret Arab societies that start popping up.
Oh yeah, they're definitely there working underground. One example, there was this secret society in Beirut around 1880 to 1883. They actually started posting placards, publicly denouncing Turkish rule, calling for outright rebellion.
Wow, that's bold. I mean, they risk a lot doing that.
Yeah, they did. And the Sultan, he wasn't going to just ignore it. He cracked down. Investigations, arrests. There was even suspicion, though it was never proven, that Midhat Pasha, the former Grand Vizier, the one who had pushed for constitutional reform, that he might have been involved somehow.
There's one specific placard that Antonius points to from December 31, 1880. Why was this one so important?
This placard is considered, the first recorded instance of a real Arab political program. It wasn't just general complaints about Turkish rule.
Okay.
It specifically condemned the suppression of the Arabic language. And it challenged the Sultan's claim to be the caliph. And it went even further. It actually called for action. It said, maybe we need to use force, but first we need to consult. We need to get organized across the Arab world. This was a sign that the movement was evolving, becoming more sophisticated, more politically aware.
And then there's Abdurrahman al-Kawakabi. Who was he, and what role did he play in this growing nationalist discourse?
Al-Kawakabi, he was this brilliant intellectual, this reformer. He was based in Aleppo, and he dedicated himself to helping the poor, to social work. He earned the nickname Father of the Weak. And he wrote two incredibly important books. One was called Al-Qura. It was this clever, disguised symposium on the fate of Islam. And the other one was called Tyranny, which was this powerful critique of despotic rule of dictators. And these books, they resonated. They gave voice to the grievances, to the anger that many Arabs were feeling.
So by the end of Abdulhamid's reign, where was this Arab national movement mostly concentrated?
Well, by then it was mostly in Syria, Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula. Egypt was a bit different. It was already under British influence, so it was outside of the Sultan's direct control.
Right.
And it had actually become this center of plotting against him. The Young Turks, they were organizing in Cairo, in Paris, and that leads us to, the Young Turk Revolution.
The Young Turks, 1908. This revolution, it really seemed to offer this hope for change, didn't it? Not just for Arabs, but for the whole Ottoman Empire.
Oh yeah, there was this initial wave of optimism. Abdulhamid was forced to reinstate the constitution, censorship was abolished, political prisoners were released. The revolution was led by this group called the Committee of Union and Progress, the CUP. They were based in Salonika, and they were really focused on getting rid of Abdulhamid.
But Antonius is careful to point out that the connection between the Arab movement and the Young Turks, it wasn't that strong at first.
No, not at all. I mean, they both hated Abdulhamid. That was their common ground.
Right.
But their goals were different. Some Arabs, mainly army officers, they joined the CUP, but they were mostly Ottoman citizens who wanted reform, not necessarily Arab nationalists who wanted independence. And the CUP itself, it was this mixed bag, Turks were the biggest group, but there were Jews, there were others, there were exiles. It wasn't just a Turkish movement.
And then you have the new Sultan, Mehmed V. He didn't exactly usher in this era of reform and progress, did he?
No, he didn't. He was a weak ruler. And the CUP, they really took advantage of that. They consolidated their power, and they established their own kind of authoritarian rule. Different from Abdulhamid's, but authoritarian nonetheless.
And their policy of Ottomanism, this idea of uniting all the different groups in the empire, it ended up backfiring, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. The idea was to create this shared Ottoman identity, to unite everyone on a basis of equality.
Okay.
But it just didn't work. Arabs saw it as, well, as Turkification in disguise. They were worried about their language, their culture, their identity being suppressed.
And then there was that imperial decree about the Arabic language. That didn't help things.
No, it didn't. On paper, it looked good. It acknowledged Arabic. It said it was important.
Okay.
But the Arabs, they saw right through it. They saw it as a stalling tactic, as a way to pacify them without actually changing anything.
And when the CUP tried to win over some Arab leaders by giving them positions in the government, that didn't go so well either, did it?
No, it backfired spectacularly. It was supposed to, buy their loyalty, but it just created more resentment, more anger. When Abdul Hamid al-Zahrawi, who had been a nationalist, when he accepted a seat in the Senate, people saw it as a betrayal. And this really marked a turning point. The Arabs had tried working within the system. They had tried agitation. They had tried this Congress in Paris, and it had all failed.
And this is when these more radical secret societies really come to the forefront.
Exactly. The disillusionment, the despair, it led to the formation of groups like Al-Fatah, the Young Arab Society, and Al-Ad, the Covenant. These were more radical, more secretive, and they were determined to achieve real change.
Antonius focuses a lot on Aziz Ali al-Misri. What was his role in all this?
Aziz Ali al-Misri was a pivotal figure. He co-founded Al-Qataniya, this early secret society that actually proposed this idea of a dual monarchy, like a separate Turkish monarchy and a separate Arab monarchy within the Ottoman Empire. Pretty radical stuff. He was also an army officer, served in Yemen, in Libya, but he was so disgusted by the CUP's policies, their Turkification policies, that he resigned his commission in protest.
And then he gets arrested in Constantinople. That turned into a pretty big international incident.
Oh, yeah. Huge. He was accused of conspiracy, put on trial. The Times, the British newspaper, they covered it extensively. There was this outcry. He was sentenced to death, but then international pressure, public pressure, it led to his sentence being commuted. He was eventually pardoned, and when he returned to Egypt, he was greeted as a hero. This whole affair, it really shook the Arab world. It exposed the COP. It showed how repressive they were. And it strengthened this desire for freedom, this desire for independence.
So as 1914 approaches, as the world is on the brink of war, what was the state of the Arab world? What did it look like according to Antonius?
Well, the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire, they were full of discontent. This nationalist sentiment was growing, even though it was still largely underground. Parts of Libya were already under Italian control. And the Senussi, this powerful religious brotherhood, they were very influential in Cyrenaica. The seeds of Arab nationalism had been sown, and everything that had happened, all the repressions, the broken promises, it just made those seeds grow stronger.
And Sharif Hussein of Mecca, his position becomes really important at this time. It's a complex situation.
Oh, yeah. Hussein was playing a delicate game. He was trying to strengthen his own position in the Hejaz to secure his family's rule.
Right.
But he also had to deal with the Ottomans, who were trying to assert more control over the region. Antonius even tells this story about how the Ottoman governor of the Hejaz, he was forced to publicly bow to Hussein to show him respect.
Wow.
It was a sign of how much influence Hussein actually had.
So Antonius gives us these population estimates for the Ottoman Empire around 1908, and it shows just how significant the Arab population was.
Yeah. At that time, the total Ottoman population was about 22 million, not including Egypt. And out of that, something like 10 million were Arabs. That's a huge number. It shows why the Arabs were becoming more assertive, why they were starting to demand more say in their own affairs.
And all these secret Arab societies, they had different ideas about what the future should look like.
Yeah, they weren't all on the same page. Some of them, like Al-Fatah, they mainly wanted more autonomy, more recognition for Arab culture and language within the Ottoman Empire.
Okay.
Others, like Al-Ad, they were already thinking about full independence, about breaking away completely from Turkish rule.
So the British see this potential, right? They see that the Arabs might be willing to side them against the Ottomans, especially if Turkey joins the war.
Exactly. Guys like Storrs and Kitchener's, the British officials in Cairo, they start to explore this possibility.
Okay.
Kitchener, he was really keen on this. He's the British agent in Egypt, and he saw the strategic value of having the Arabs on their side.
Makes sense.
So he tells Storrs, the Oriental secretary, to reach out to Abdullah, one of Hussein's sons. He wants to know where Hussein stands, what he'll do if Turkey joins the war on Germany's side.
So this leads to the first direct contact, the first real conversation about a possible alliance.
It does. Adi Effendi is sent to Mecca to deliver Kitchener's message, and Abdullah sends back a written reply. This is the beginning of what will become a very complex and, well, ultimately tragic relationship.
The British were also worried about the Ottoman Sultan using his position as caliph to call for a jihad, a holy war, against them.
Oh yeah, that was a huge concern. The Ottoman Empire had millions of Muslim subjects, and if the Sultan called for a jihad, well, it could have had a huge impact, especially on British India.
Right.
But there are also factors that might weaken the appeal of a jihad. I mean, if the Ottomans were allied with Christian powers like Germany, that would definitely make things awkward.
So Turkey enters the war on the side of the Central Powers, and Antonius argues that this automatically brings the Arab question to the forefront of European politics.
Yeah, it's not just an internal Ottoman issue anymore. Now it's this international question, a strategic question for the Allies, especially for Britain and France.
The Ottomans, they start making some pretty hostile moves in Syria.
Oh yeah, they form the Fourth Army, and they make it clear their goal is to attack Egypt. They mass troops near the Egyptian border. They send arms and money to the Bedouin tribes to try to stir up trouble. They have creatures whipping up anti-British sentiment. And German officers, they arrive in Syria to help the Ottomans. These are getting very tense.
So what about the Arabian Peninsula? What's the situation there?
Well, the Ottomans have garrisons in the Hejaz, in Asir, in Yemen. But in the Hejaz, Sharif Hussein, he's the one who really controls the Arab tribes.
Right.
He could raise a big fighting force if he wanted to. And the Ottomans, they know this. If they want to use those tribes in the war, they need Hussein on their side.
But Hussein, he's got options, doesn't he? He's got the British offer and he's got the call to jihad.
Exactly. He's in a tough spot. Kitchener's offer is tempting, but he needs to be careful. He needs to consult with the Arab nationalists in Syria and Iraq. He needs to talk to the other Arab leaders. He can't just jump into this.
And the Ottomans, they're trying to make it look like he's supporting the jihad, aren't they?
Oh, yeah, they're running this propaganda campaign, trying to convince everyone that Hussein is with them. They're spreading rumors. They're putting out fake news. They're desperate to keep the Arabs on their side.
But the Arab nationalists, they're not buying it.
No, they're not. Groups like Al-Ad and Al-Fatah, they send messages to Hussein. They're urging him to be cautious. They're saying, don't do anything against the Ottomans until we have guarantees from the Allies, until we know they'll support Arab independence.
So this leads to the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence, right? This is where things start to get really interesting. What were the main thing the Arabs were asking for?
So in his first letter, dated July 14, 1915, Hussein lays out the Arab demands. They want independence, recognition of an independent Arab state. And they want it within specific boundaries, including Syria, Palestine, parts of Arabia, and Iraq. And they have conditions. They want a defensive alliance with Britain. They want economic preference for Britain in the future Arab state. And they want British support in actually setting up this state.
This becomes known as the Damascus Protocol.
Right. The core principles are laid out here.
So how did the British respond? What did McMahon say?
Well, McMahon, he's the British High Commissioner in Egypt. He responds in October 1915. He says he's generally happy with the idea, but he has some reservations.
Okay.
He says they can't include areas west of Damascus, Homs, Hama, Aleppo. He says they have treaty obligations, other interests. It's pretty clear he's talking about the French, who have their own claims in the region.
So what does Hussein do?
Hussein replies in November 1915. He says, okay, we can temporarily exclude those areas, but we're not giving up our claim to them.
Smart.
He's being pragmatic, but he's also making sure the Arab claims aren't forgotten.
And McMahon, what does he say to that?
He replies in December 1915. He says he's happy with Hussein's flexibility, but he repeats the British reservations about northern Syria.
Because of the French?
Exactly. And when it comes to Iraq, how they'll administer Iraq together, he gets a bit vague. He's not as clear, not as committed as he was before.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and then Hussein sends his fourth letter in January 1916. And in this letter, he seems to think that the deal is done.
Really? Despite all the vagueness, all the reservations?
Yeah. He says he's going to proclaim the revolt soon, and that he'll let McMahon know what they need in terms of support.
Why do you think he did that? Why did he think it was a done deal?
Antonius thinks it's because Hussein really believed in British integrity. He trusted them more than he trusted the other European powers.
A misplaced trust, perhaps.
Maybe so. And then there's this whole issue of Palestine. It's become this really contentious point, hasn't it? Whether Palestine was included in the area McMahon promised to the Arabs.
It has. A lot of debate about that.
Yeah. And Antonius, he's very clear. Based on the actual text of the letters, he says Palestine was not explicitly excluded. He argues that the British arguments later on about why Palestine wasn't part of the deal, they don't hold up when you look at the language, the geography, how things were understood at the time.
So we can, if the Arab revolt itself, it starts in June 1916. What finally pushed Hussein to take this step, to actually launch the revolt?
Well, things have been getting really bad in Syria. Jamal Pasha, the Ottoman commander, he was cracking down hard on Arab nationalists. There were arrests, executions.
Right.
In May 1916, 21 Arab leaders, Muslims and Christians, they were executed in Beirut and Damascus. They were accused of treason, of wanting to separate Syria, Palestine, and Iraq from the Ottoman Empire. This was a turning point. And then you have Faisal, Hussein's son. He comes back to Mecca, but he tricks Jamal Pasha into thinking he's just there to round up recruits.
Okay.
But in reality, He's there to finalize the plans for the revolt.
So the revolt begins. What were the first key events?
It starts in June 1916. Hussein makes this proclamation in Mecca, and then the Arab forces attack the Ottoman barracks in the city.
Okay.
They quickly capture Jeddah, a vital port city. And what's interesting is that the Ottomans, they try to keep it quiet, they deny it's happening, and then when they finally admit it, they put out this distorted version of events.
They're trying to control the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. But the news gets out, and Jamal Pasha, he's furious. He lashes out in Damascus, arresting more Arabs, torturing them. And in Lebanon, martial law is tightened even further. And the whole region is suffering. There's this terrible famine. People are starving.
So the British and French, they move in quickly to support the Arab forces.
They do. They set up missions in Jeddah. T.E. Lawrence, he arrives to advise the Arabs to help coordinate support. It's all under the command of Sir Reginald Wingate, the British High Commissioner in Egypt.
So the Arabs are now actively fighting in the war. What were their main contributions?
Well, they captured some key towns along the coast, places like Waj and Aqaba, which was really important because it gave them a link to British supplies.
Right.
They also launched these raids on the Hejaz Railway, which was a vital supply line for the Ottomans. They were really disrupting the Ottoman war effort.
And Antonius says that the Arab army, it actually becomes a much more effective fighting force as the war goes on.
Yeah, they get better training, they get better equipment from the British, rifles, ammunition, things like that. Faisal's army, it grows, it includes regular troops, it includes tribal contingents. More and more Arab leaders are joining the revolt.
Their ultimate goal was Damascus, and they did play a key role in its capture in 1918, didn't they?
They did. In 1918, they drive towards Damascus, and on October 1st, they capture the city. They enter alongside British forces, a symbolic victory. Then they capture Homs and Hama, and then